Welcome to Wispy History, where the past drifts softly through the veil of time and stories unfold like forgotten dreams. Each night, we journey together through the echoes of history, tales of empires, philosophers, inventors, and mysteries that shaped our world, one whispered story at a time. Before we begin, take a moment, breathe in, settle down, and let me know where you're listening from and what time it is there. I love knowing how far our quiet community reaches. If you'd like to keep these stories alive, you can support Wispy History by liking this video and subscribing to the channel. Now, find a comfortable spot, close your eyes, and let your mind drift as we step softly into tonight's story. It was the year 1184 on the great Mongolian steppe. A chill night wind whispered over the grasslands, carrying with it the fading echo of hoofbeats. Under a pale moon, a lone rider urged his horse onward. This rider was a young man named Temujin, who in time would be known to the world as Genghis Khan. But tonight, he was simply a husband racing home, dread clawing at his heart. As Temujin crested the last hill to his encampment by the river, an unsettling silence greeted him. No voices of his family, no barking of dogs, only the crackle of dying embers from a fire that had burned to ash. His family's ger, the round felt tent, stood ahead in the clearing. By moonlight, Temujin could see its door flaps swaying open. He dismounted and called softly, "Börte," hoping to see the warm glow of lamplight and his wife's face emerging. There was no answer. He stepped inside the ger. Empty. The hearth was cold. Blankets were thrown aside. A clay pot lay shattered on the floor. Börte, his wife, was gone. Temujin's pulse quickened. He spun around, scanning the ground. In the silvery light, he saw chaos. Footprints and hoofprints trampled all around their camp. There were signs of a struggle, scattered belongings, an overturned stool, arrows stuck quivering in the dirt. A dread certainty washed over him. The Merkits had come. A raid, swift and sudden, under cover of darkness. They had taken her. For a moment, Temujin stood frozen, his breath shallow and white in the cold night air. Börte, she was everything to him, his beloved wife, his closest confidant, the one person who had truly believed in him. Now she had been stolen away, and the life they had begun to build together lay in ruins around him. He knelt and pressed a hand to the cold earth, fingers tracing the hoofprints that led off north into the darkness. His chest felt as though it were being ripped open from the inside. Later, he would tell people that when Börte was taken, his bed felt empty and his heart was torn apart. In that empty, ruined camp on the steppe, Temujin's anguish slowly turned into resolve. Grief was giving way to cold, steely rage. He knew why the Merkits had done this. It was not a random act of banditry. It was revenge. Years ago, Temujin's own father had stolen a woman from the Merkit tribe. That woman became Temujin's mother. The Merkits had never forgotten the humiliation. Now they had come to settle the score. A wife for a wife. By kidnapping Temujin's bride, they intended to pay back the debt of vengeance in blood and tears. They likely assumed that Temujin, an upstart young man with a small following, would be unable to retaliate in any meaningful way. Perhaps they thought he would accept his loss quietly, as was often the custom, or be too weak to respond. They were wrong. Temujin rose to his feet, fists clenched, staring into the dark horizon where the tracks disappeared. He might have been just a small chieftain's son, nearly alone in the world, but he would not let this stand. The Merkits could not have known it, but by taking Börte, they had ignited a fire in Temujin's soul, a fire that would soon spread far beyond a simple raid. In this moment, beneath the wheeling stars and endless sky, the young outcast made a silent vow. He would get Börte back, whatever it took. And not only that, he would make the Merkits pay dearly for what they had done. In stealing his wife, they had signed the death warrant of their entire tribe. This is the story of that fateful night and all that followed. How the kidnapping of one woman set a young man on the path to becoming a world conqueror. It was the night everything changed for Temujin, transforming his personal desperation into destiny. To truly understand how such a tragedy could spark the rise of Genghis Khan, we must journey back to Temujin's youth, years before this night, to see who he was and what struggles shaped him. So let us turn back the clock and picture the Mongolian steppe many years earlier, when Temujin was just a boy and his world was about to be upended. Many years before he became a feared warlord, Temujin was born on the open steppe, not far from the banks of the Onon River. The exact year of his birth is uncertain. Legends say 1162, though some say a few years earlier or later, but the season was spring when the grass was green and rolling under the breeze. He was born with a blood clot clenched in his tiny fist, a sign that Mongols believed marked a child destined for greatness or violence. His father, Yesugei, was a minor chieftain of the Borjigin clan, part of the fragmented Mongol tribes that wandered these grasslands. They named the boy Temujin after a Tatar warrior whom Yesugei had recently captured in battle. It was a name without grandeur, given to an infant whose future was anything but assured. Temujin's early childhood was harsh, but not without hope. He grew up in a wide valley of the high plains, in a family of nomads. He learned to ride a horse almost as soon as he could walk, and by age 4 or 5, he was shooting a tiny bow from the back of a pony, as all Mongol boys did. His mother, Heilun, was a strong and resourceful woman, and from her he learned endurance and cunning. She had a remarkable story of her own. She originally came from a different tribe and had been engaged to a Merkit warrior. But on the journey to her new husband's camp, Yesugei and his men ambushed the party. Yesugei abducted Huelun and made her his wife. It was a common practice on the steppe, bride stealing, and it sowed the seeds for future feuds. Huelun adjusted to her new life and bore Yesugei several children. Temujin was her first son with Yesugei. The family's fortunes took a dark turn when Temujin was about 9 years old. Yesugei, the father, was traveling home after taking young Temujin to arrange a marriage, a journey we will return to shortly. Along the way, Yesugei encountered a camp of Tatars, another nomadic tribe, and joined them for a feast. The Tatars recognized him as an enemy who had once fought them. With smiling faces, they offered him food and drink. Unbeknownst to Yesugei, the Tatars had poisoned his cup. He left the feast feeling ill and managed to make it home, but the poison worked its cruel toll. Yesugei died painfully, leaving Heilun a widow and his children fatherless. Temujin's world was shattered overnight. He was just a boy, suddenly the nominal head of his family, with the weight of caring for his mother and siblings on his small shoulders. Worse was yet to come. When a leader died among the Mongol clans, it was not guaranteed that his family would keep their status. Yesugei had been a respected warrior, but with him gone, his followers saw little reason to remain loyal to a widow and her young children. The family's own clan, the Taichiud, allies of Yesugei, decided to cast them out. One day, the Taichiud leaders simply left the camp, taking with them the people and livestock that had been under Yesugei's leadership. They abandoned Heilun and the children, Temujin and his 6 siblings, taking almost all the family's herds of horses, sheep, and yaks. Heilun rode after them, carrying Yesugei's banner and desperately imploring the tribe to stay. Some were moved and wanted to remain with her, but the departing chieftains forced those sympathetic few to leave as well. In the end, Heilun and her children were left utterly alone on the steppe, with only a small handful of animals and no allies. Thus began a period of profound hardship. Temujin's family had no tribe, no support. They were on their own in the unforgiving wilderness of Mongolia. Heilun, however, refused to give in to despair. A woman of great courage and resourcefulness, she became the sole provider for her children. Proudly, she tied up her robe and set to work. By day and night, Heilun foraged for food along the banks of the Onon River. With a simple juniper stick, she dug into the ground for wild roots and onions. She gathered berries, pears, and wild fruits from the sparse trees and bushes. The children helped as best they could. Young Temujin and his brothers learned to fish in the river, fashioning hooks from bent needles to catch small fish in their nets. They chased marmots and rabbits across the plains to add a bit of meat to their meager stews. Often, their meals were nothing more than fish and wild garlic or the roasted roots their mother unearthed. Hunger was a constant companion, and some days their stomachs clenched empty through the night. But Heilun's determination kept them alive. "Eat, my sons," she would urge, handing them bits of food she'd scavenged. Many years later, the secret history of the Mongols would recount how those boys, nourished on wild onions, wild pears, and the bitter roots their mother dug up, grew up hardy and fierce, tempered by adversity into survivors. Temujin learned many lessons in those lean years. He learned that survival on the steppe required loyalty within one's family and courage in the face of cruelty. Yet, ironically, even within his own small family, conflicts arose. Food was so scarce that every scrap was precious. Temujin was the second oldest male child. He had an older half-brother named Börte, the son of Yesuge by another wife. As the eldest male, Börte at times tried to assert authority and was accused of taking more than his share of food from the younger siblings. Tensions between Temujin and Börte escalated dangerously. One day, when Temujin was still just a youth, that tension exploded into violence. In a grim confrontation, Temujin and his full brother Kasar stalked Börte with bows in hand. They accused Börte of withholding food and endangering their survival. Börte, understanding what was coming, sat on a hill and refused to fight his younger brothers. Temujin loosed an arrow and Kasar followed. Together, they killed Börte. It was a shocking act, fratricide born of desperation and the fierce will to survive. When it was done, Temujin's mother Heilun was furious and heartbroken. She berated Temujin, asking if that was how he meant to repay her for all her sacrifices. Temujin said little in response, but he never forgot the sting of her words. The killing of Börte was a dark stain on his youth, a sign of how the brutal realities of life had hardened him. It taught Temujin that to lead, even within a family, sometimes meant making terrible choices, but it also taught him the weight of guilt and responsibility. As the years passed, Temujin grew into a tall, tough teenager with penetrating eyes and a resolute spirit. His family scraped by through the seasons thanks to Heilun's leadership and the boys' efforts. Despite their hardship, or perhaps because of it, Temujin developed a fierce determination and a keen sense of loyalty to those who stood by him. He also learned that mercy and cruelty were two edges of the same blade on the steppe, each to be used when appropriate. One formative episode occurred when Temujin was about 14. The same Taichud clan that had abandoned his family decided to hunt him down. Perhaps they feared young Temujin might someday challenge their power, or perhaps they saw a chance to enslave him. A group of warriors ambushed Temujin and captured him. They put a heavy wooden kang, a board used as a collar, around his neck to prevent his escape and paraded him as a prisoner. Temujin became a slave in the camp of the very people who had left his family to die. He bided his time, enduring indignities and forced labor. One day, he saw an opportunity. He managed to knock down a guard and slip out of the camp, still wearing the heavy wooden yoke. With his heart pounding, Temujin fled into the darkness. He stumbled to the shores of a river and hid among the reeds and mud, submerging himself to avoid the search parties. The Taichud warriors scoured the area but could not find him. In that moment, a local man named Sorkhan Shira took pity on the boy. This man, though part of the Taichud camp, secretly helped Temujin. He freed him from the Kangay and hid him in a cart under wool. When the searchers came to Sorkhan Shira's homestead looking for the fugitive, he deceived them, saving Temujin's life. Once the pursuit waned, Temujin slipped away under cover of night. He had escaped his enemies by a mix of his own daring and the kindness of an unexpected ally. It was another lesson. Even in a world of betrayal, loyalty, and compassion could be found, sometimes in surprising places. Temujin never forgot Sorkhan Shira's help. Later, when he held power, he rewarded Sorkhan Shira and spared his family from any retribution. This episode instilled in Temujin the idea that showing mercy to those who helped him could yield great loyalty, while those who wronged him should beware his vengeance. Amidst these struggles of youth, there was one beacon of hope and stability in Temujin's life: a young woman named Börte. The story of Temujin and Börte began when he was just a boy, before his father's death. In those days, it was customary for Mongol families to arrange marriages early to secure alliances. When Temujin was around 9 years old, Yasuge sought to betroth him to a girl from a friendly tribe. Yasuge traveled east to the lands of the Conquest tribe, which was his wife Hoelun's ancestral group. On the way, he happened to meet a chief named Day Sechen of the Ongurat, another name for the Conquest. As fate would have it, the night before this meeting, Day Sechen had dreamed of a falcon bringing the sun and dropping it into his lap. A strange dream he interpreted as an auspicious sign. When Yasuge arrived unexpectedly with his young son, Day Sechen took it as the fulfillment of that omen. Over a shared meal, the two men discussed uniting their families. Day Sechen said that the women of his lineage were known for their beauty and wisdom, and he had a daughter named Börte who was about 10 years old, just a year older than Temujin. Yasuge met the girl and was impressed. Börte had fair skin, it was said, with light in her face and fire in her eyes, a phrase that signified intelligence and vigor. To Yasuge, she seemed a perfect match for Temujin. He agreed on the spot to betroth his son to Börte. By custom, Temujin stayed behind with Börte's family for a time as a kind of fosterage, a way of cementing the future union by having the boy learn the ways of the girl's tribe. The two children, Temujin and Börte, spent some time together in Day Sechen's camp. We can imagine them shyly getting acquainted. Temujin, a wiry boy from a struggling family, and Börte, a lively girl with a quick mind. Perhaps they rode horses together on the grasslands or helped herd sheep side by side, beginning to form a quiet bond. Börte likely sensed the difficult circumstances Temujin came from, yet she saw something in him, maybe a determination or charisma beyond his years. For Temujin, Börte's home was a warmer, more stable environment than he had known in some time. But this peaceful interlude did not last long. News arrived that Temujin's father, Yasuge, had been poisoned by the Tatars and lay dying. Hearing this, Day Sechen allowed Temujin to leave at once, despite the betrothal agreement, so that he could return to his mother and siblings. Temujin hurried back, finding his father alive but gravely ill. Soon after, Yasuge died, and the calamities of abandonment and poverty that we have described fell upon Temujin's family. In the chaos of these events, Temujin and Börte were separated for several years. He was just a child, fighting to survive. She remained with her tribe, growing into a young woman. Yet Temujin never forgot Börte. Through the hardest days, whether hiding from enemies or scavenging for food, he carried in his heart the memory of the girl who was promised to be his wife. That promise represented a better future, a normal life that he desperately longed for. So as soon as Temujin felt he was capable of doing so, he set out to find Börte again and fulfill their betrothal. He was about 16 years old when he decided the time was right. By then, his situation had improved slightly. He had reconnected with some allies of his late father and begun to gather a small following of his own. One important ally was a young man named Jamuka, a childhood friend from another clan. Jamuka and Temujin had met when they were kids and had sworn Anda, blood brotherhood, pledging loyalty to each other. This friendship would later prove pivotal and painful, but for now, Jamukha's camaraderie gave Temujin a sense of belonging and support. With a few companions by his side, Temujin rode to Day Session's village to claim Börte as his bride. He found Börte right where she had been years before, now a blossoming young woman around 17. She remembered him, of course, the boy who had stayed with them, whose father had died so tragically. Börte welcomed Temujin with a mixture of joy and relief. In those days, a broken engagement could doom a girl's prospects, but Temujin had returned to honor his promise. They were married soon after, in a simple Mongol ceremony. We can imagine the scene. Families gathered under the eternal blue sky, horses tethered nearby, offerings made to the spirits of earth and sky for the couple's happiness. Temujin likely presented gifts to Börte's family, and she came to him with a dowry as well. Among her dowry items was one particularly precious thing, a coat made of fine black sable fur, the kind of luxurious garment that could be owned only by someone of status. It was a gift worthy of a Khan's daughter, and indeed Börte was from a respected lineage. For Temujin, marrying Börte was more than just a romantic union. It was the first real stability he had known since childhood. In Börte, he found not only a wife, but a true partner and ally. She was intelligent, strong-willed, and utterly loyal to him. After so many years of chaos, isolation, and betrayal, Temujin finally had someone beside him whom he could trust completely. They set up their own household, establishing a new camp by the Sengir stream in the hills, and later near the Burgi escarpment by the Karulin River. Their camp was modest, just a few jurs, and their small band of family and followers. Yet within that humble encampment, Temujin and Börte created a pocket of warmth and hope. They were young, he in his late teens and she around 18, but they shared big dreams. Börte understood the difficulties Temujin had endured, and she supported his ambitions to restore his family's honor and perhaps even to rise above the station he was born into. One early demonstration of the couple's teamwork and foresight came soon after their marriage. Temujin possessed very little at that time. His inheritance had been stolen and his clan scattered. The most valuable thing he could call his own was now Börte's dowry, the black sable fur coat. Such a coat was a prize of incredible worth on the steppe, something one might trade for a herd of horses or keep to show one's wealth. But Temujin saw in that coat an opportunity far greater than material comfort. He decided to use it to win an alliance. There was a powerful Mongol lord named Togrul Khan, also known as Wang Khan, who ruled the Karaite tribe. Togrul had been a close friend and blood brother, Anda, of Temujin's father, Yesuge. In Mongol culture, a sworn brotherhood was a bond almost as sacred as bloodkin, an oath to treat one another as family. Temujin hoped that this old bond could be revived to his benefit, so he took the precious sable coat and traveled to find Togrul. When he met the Karaite Khan, Temujin presented the coat to him as a gift of respect and remembrance. This was no small gesture. The sable fur was likely the most expensive possession he had, symbolizing Börte's value and the wealth of her family. By handing it over, Temujin was effectively giving up a treasure in exchange for goodwill and alliance. Togrul was deeply pleased by the gift. He remembered Yesuge and saw in Temujin a loyal son honoring his father's friendships. Accepting the sable coat, Togrul declared that he would treat Temujin as his own son. In practical terms, this meant that Temujin now had a powerful patron. Togrul, the Khan of the Karaites, had thousands of warriors at his command and significant influence among the Mongol tribes. For someone as vulnerable as Temujin had been, securing Togrul's favor was like obtaining a protective shield. Börte understood the importance of this alliance. In fact, it was said that she fully supported Temujin's decision to part with her precious dowry coat. She knew that the backing of Togrul Khan was worth far more than any luxury. This episode showed how perceptive and strategic Börte could be, even from the very start of their marriage. She and Temujin both were willing to sacrifice immediate wealth for the sake of long-term security and power. With Togrul's friendship renewed and Jamukha's companionship steady, Temujin's situation improved in the few years after his marriage. He began to gather a small following of his own among relatives and wanderers who found his leadership appealing. Perhaps a few dozen families in total camped with him and Börte. Word spread that this young man, once left to die in the wilderness, now had the ear of Togrul Khan and the makings of a decent-sized camp. Men who had known his father started to take notice, and some joined him, attracted by his determination and the charisma he was quietly developing. Temujin was still very much a minor player on the steppe, a young chieftain with a tiny clan, but he was ambitious, and crucially, he had a close-knit team: his wife, his mother and brothers, and his handful of allies. Together, they were determined to carve out a place in a world dominated by larger, more powerful tribes. That world, the political landscape of the Mongolian plains in the late 12th century, was tumultuous and treacherous. The Mongol peoples were not a unified nation, but a patchwork of tribes and confederations constantly jostling for power. To the east were the Tatars, fierce and numerous, sometimes allies of the Chinese empires and mortal enemies of Temujin's own people. Indeed, the Tatars were responsible for his father's death. To the west lay the Merkit tribes, clans of hardy herdsmen and fishermen, living along the Selenga and Orkhon rivers and around the northern forests by Lake Baikal. The Merkits were known to be proud and vengeful, a reputation Temujin would soon experience firsthand. Further west and south were larger powers like the Naiman tribe, ruled by ambitious Khans, and the vast steppe federation of the Karaite under Togrul. There were also the Uyghur oasis kingdoms, the Tangut and the Jin dynasty beyond the steppe, often pulling strings by allying with one tribe or another to keep the steppe divided. Amid these contending groups, Temujin's nascent band was small, but he was already trying to navigate the shifting alliances. He knew that alone he could achieve little. His earlier trials had taught him the value of forging bonds. Togrul's backing gave him some standing. Jamukha, who came from the Jadaran clan, brought his own network of friends and kin. Temujin also carefully maintained ties with his own relatives from the Borjigin line and his mother's Olkhonud kin where possible. In this volatile environment, one had to make friends wherever one could, even while preparing to defend against those same friends should fortunes change. It was said that the Mongols of that time had a proverb: there can be no friend greater than one's own ambition, and no enemy worse than one's own anger. Temujin was ambitious indeed, but he was learning to master his anger and use alliance and strategy instead of brute force, at least until brute force was required. For a while, it seemed Temujin and Börte might be able to settle into a relatively peaceful life building their community. They likely imagined raising children, growing their herds, and slowly increasing their influence through marriages and friendships. Börte became pregnant not long after their marriage, and around 1179 she gave birth to a baby girl, whom they named Kojin. This first child brought great joy to Temujin's heart. He finally had a family of his own making, something he had yearned for in the lonely days of his youth. But the steppe does not grant peace for long to those destined for greatness. Just as Temujin's life was stabilizing, fate dealt him a cruel blow. In the early spring of 1184, or by some accounts 1181, dates are hazy in the oral histories, but we will follow the timeline that places this event in 1184. The storm that had been brewing in the shadows finally struck. The Merkit tribe, who had harbored a grudge against Temujin's family for decades, saw an opportunity to get revenge. The spark of their hatred went back to that incident many years before, when Yesuge abducted Helun, Temujin's mother, from her Merkit fiancé. The man Helun was taken from was a Merkit warrior named Yehe. He had loved Helun and was bringing her home to marry him when Yesuge swooped in and stole her. The Merkit had never forgiven this. In their culture, such an affront demanded retribution sooner or later. The very existence of Temujin was a reminder of their humiliation. After all, he was the son born of the union of Yesuge and the stolen woman. As Temujin started to become a notable figure, however small, the Merkits must have kept watch. By 1184, Temujin was married and living somewhat independently. Crucially, Togrul and Jamukha, his two big allies, were not with him at that moment. Perhaps Togrul was occupied with his own tribe, and Jamukha was in a different area with his people. Temujin's camp was relatively isolated in that season. To the Merkit, this looked like the perfect chance to strike and claim their long-awaited vengeance. They planned to repay a wife for a wife. They would kidnap Temujin's wife, Börte, just as Temujin's father had stolen a wife from them. An eye for an eye, a bride for a bride. One cold dawn, the Merkit revenge came galloping out of the north. It happened swiftly, without warning. Temujin's camp was set in a quiet hollow next to the river, the Gurs snug against a line of hills. Inside, families slept under layers of felt and fur. Börte likely woke to the sound of dogs barking frantically in the distance, or perhaps to the thunder of hooves as hundreds of riders descended on the camp. Before anyone could fully grasp what was happening, Merkit warriors poured in. There may have been 300 of them or more, a formidable raiding party with one aim: seize the women and goods and kill any who resisted. Shouts rang out, the early morning light filled with the din of chaos. Temujin sprang awake to the noise and immediately understood. They were under attack. He grabbed his bow and sword, heart hammering. In the gray pre-dawn, he could see riders circling, silhouettes of men on horseback brandishing spears and screaming war cries. The Merkit were known for their ferocity, and they attacked with full force. Arrows whistled through the air, thudding into the sides of Gurs. One of Temujin's brothers yanked open the door flap and yelled for everyone to get to the horses. The only chance was to flee. They were far outnumbered. Temujin rushed out into the melee. Amid the confusion, he desperately looked for Börte. He saw his younger brothers and his mother Helun mounting horses, ushering children up behind riders. Börte was not immediately in sight. Perhaps she had been in a different ger or was helping gather some essential belongings. As the camp fell into panic, a loyal family retainer, one of the household servants, grabbed Börte's hand. According to one account, this quick-thinking servant dragged Börte to an old wooden cart kept near the tents. With no spare horses left, he helped Börte climb into the two-wheeled cart and hitched an ox to it in a frantic attempt to get her away. The ox bellowed and started lumbering along the riverbank, pulling the cart with Börte huddled inside. It was a desperate plan. An ox cart is slow and cumbersome, no match for mounted warriors. But it was the only option since all the horses had been taken by those fleeing on horseback. Meanwhile, Temujin and a few men tried to mount a rearguard action to delay the Merkit onslaught. He loosed arrows at the attackers, managing to drop one or two pursuers as his family scrambled onto horses. The adrenaline pounded in his veins. His thoughts must have been a blur of fear for Börte and the instinct to survive. One of his brothers shouted that there were no more horses. They had set loose whatever they could, but Börte's was nowhere to be found in the confusion. A crushing realization hit Temujin. They could not reach Börte in time. Merkit warriors swarmed into the camp proper, grabbing whatever of value they could and rounding up those who hadn't escaped. Temujin's companions urged him to go, to save himself, so he could fight another day. In that harrowing moment, Temujin had to make an agonizing choice. To stay and fight hundreds of Merkit alone would be suicide, and it would not save Börte. He had to flee, regroup, and hope for a chance to rescue her later. Gritting his teeth, feeling as though he were tearing himself in two, Temujin turned his horse and followed his family at a gallop away from the camp. It was the hardest decision of his life, to leave Börte behind, even temporarily. But he carried with him the image of her and the resolve to return for her, whatever the cost. As Temujin and his surviving family disappeared into the south, the Merkits chased them only so far before turning back to seize the spoils of the raid. They caught up to the ox cart rattling along the riverbank. The cart's wooden axle had already broken under the strain of rough terrain. When Börte and her servant abandoned the cart and tried to run on foot, they were quickly surrounded. Börte was captured by the Merkit raiders, struggling and shouting in vain. The Merkits gathered their plunder, livestock, a few captives including Börte, and swiftly withdrew, driving their loot northward. They had what they came for. Börte, the young wife of Temujin, was now a prisoner, her fate in the hands of those who took her to avenge an old insult. When the dust settled, the camp by the river was a smoldering ruin. A few empty jars stood with flaps torn open. Cooking pots and broken arrows littered the ground. The first light of sunrise revealed the total devastation. Temujin crept back later that day once he was sure the raiders had gone. What he saw broke him inside. The camp was silent except for the buzzing of flies around spilled milk and the distant cry of a frightened horse left behind. Temujin dismounted and walked through the remains of his home. The place where he and Börte had slept was ransacked, her belongings strewn about. He found a piece of her robe torn and trampled in the dirt. Gently, he picked it up and held it, feeling utterly hollow. That was when he felt the last traces of boyhood in him fall away, replaced by something cold and immovable. By that evening, Temujin had regrouped with his brothers and a few others in a safe spot in the wilderness. His mother and younger siblings were miraculously unharmed, having escaped early in the attack. But Börte was gone, and with her, a piece of Temujin's soul. He sat apart from the others by the small fire they dared to light. He did not speak for a long time. Witnesses say his face was like stone, but his eyes burned with tears he refused to let fall. Hilun, seeing her son's anguish, quietly approached and placed a comforting hand on his shoulder. Temujin, who had survived so many miseries, now felt a deeper pain than ever before. Börte was more than a wife. She was the first person in his adult life who had given him unconditional loyalty and love. Losing her was a personal devastation beyond any loss of wealth or pride. That night, Temujin could barely sleep. When he closed his eyes, he saw images of Börte being dragged away. Her terrified face, the Merkit warriors laughing as they took her. Every time he drifted off, he would jolt awake, heart racing and fury rising anew. He got up and paced under the stars. All around him stretched the vast emptiness of the steppe, indifferent to his grief. Temujin realized he needed time to think and plan. The immediate shock had passed, and now a grim clarity set in. To rescue Börte, he would have to act shrewdly. First, they had to ensure their own safety. The Merkit raiders might return to hunt them, though raiding parties rarely lingered after achieving their goal. Temujin led his small band, family and remaining companions into the mountains for refuge. They rode to the sacred slopes of Börte Khaldun, a forested mountain that Temujin held in reverence. This mountain had sheltered him once before during his escape from the Taichiud, and now it offered sanctuary again. On Börte Khaldun's wooded ridges, they found a hidden valley with fresh water and grass for the horses. Here, Temujin and his group hid for several days, resting and gathering strength while the Merkit raiders put distance between them. During those days on Börte Khaldun, Temujin grappled with despair and determined his course of action. According to legend, on that mountain, Temujin prayed fervently to Tengri, the eternal blue sky, and to the spirits of his ancestors. At dawn, he climbed alone to a high point, where the first rays of sun broke over the endless horizon of grasslands. He is said to have bowed down, offering thanks for his own survival and pleading for aid to save Börte. In one account from the secret history, Temujin vowed that if he were granted the strength to rescue his wife and avenge this wrong, he would make offerings and honor the sacred mountain forever. Perhaps he cried out into the chill morning air a promise that he would not forget the help of heaven, just as he would never forget a wrong done to him. In those quiet moments of prayer and reflection, Temujin steeled himself. The Merkit had delivered a cruel wound, but they had also lit within him a ferocious purpose. After ensuring the immediate safety of his family, Temujin wasted no time in plotting his next moves. The Merkit were far too powerful for him to challenge alone. At that time, Temujin's personal band of fighting men numbered perhaps only in the dozens, 100 at most, and many had been scattered by the raid. The Merkit were a confederation of clans with thousands of warriors at their command. Temujin was intelligent and realistic. He knew that if he simply rushed after Börte with the few men he had, it would likely mean death for all of them, and doom for Börte as well. So he set aside any foolish notions of a lone hero's rescue. He needed an army. And to get an army, he needed allies. Big allies. Temujin thought of Togrul Khan of the Karaites, his father's old friend to whom he had given the sable coat. Togrul had once promised to help Temujin in times of need, effectively saying, "I will be your foster father and support you." If ever there was a time to call in that promise, it was now. Temujin also thought of his blood brother Jamuka. The two had drifted apart in the year or two since Temujin's marriage, as each attended to his own followers. But their bond of Onda was still there. Jamuka was known as a charismatic leader in his own right. He hailed from the Jadaran clan and had gathered a substantial following of young warriors. Between Togrul and Jamuka, Temujin saw a chance to muster a force large enough to take on the Merkits. With resolve, Temujin set out from Burkhan Khaldun as soon as he could. He left his mother and siblings in a safe locale, likely with relatives or in hiding, and took a handful of his most trusted men. They rode hard southward to find Togrul Khan. Each day on the trail, Temujin's mind raced ahead to the goal, securing Togrul's military support. He rehearsed what he would say, how he would appeal to Togrul's sense of honor and obligation. In his saddlebag, Temujin may have carried a token or message from his late father, something to remind Togrul of his oath to Yesugei's son. In any case, he had the strongest argument of all. The black sable coat he had gifted was effectively a down payment on Togrul's aid, and now he would ask the Karaite king to fulfill his side of the pact. After several days of travel, Temujin reached Togrul's territory. He likely found the Khan at his main camp, a large encampment of round white jurs belonging to the Karaite nobles, banners fluttering, flocks and herds grazing over distant hills. Togrul Khan received Temujin, perhaps surprised by the sudden visit of his adopted son. Temujin approached the Khan with respect, but also with an impassioned plea. He explained the situation. The Merkit had abducted Börte, his wife, in a brutal raid, and he was utterly bereft. He reminded Togrul of how Yesugei and Togrul had been as close as brothers, and how Togrul had welcomed Temujin as a son. Now Temujin said he needed his fatherly help to right this grievous wrong. In Mongol culture, personal relationships and promises were deeply significant. An injury to one's son or sworn kin demanded redress. Togrul listened, and his sympathy was aroused. Here was a chance for Togrul as well. By aiding Temujin, he could hurt the Merkits, who were rivals and sometimes enemies of the Karit, and also solidify his own influence over the young rising warrior. Moved by Temujin's plight and bound by the debt of the sable coat, Togrul did not hesitate. He promised to help Temujin retrieve Börte and to punish the Merkits for their audacity. Legend has it that Togrul said to Temujin, "I will gather my warriors. For the sake of the friendship I bore your father and the loyalty you have shown, I shall be your arrowhead. In other words, Togrul committed to lead a wing of the attack against the Merkits. Temujin felt a surge of gratitude and hope. One ally was secured. Next, Temujin turned to Jamuka. Sending envoys or traveling himself, accounts vary, Temujin reached out to his Anda, his sworn brother, to ask for aid. When Jamuka heard what had happened, that Temujin's camp was attacked and Börte taken, he was outraged on his friend's behalf. Jamuka and Temujin had shared deep bonds as teenagers, exchanging gifts and vows of brotherhood. They affectionately called each other Anda, an even older and younger brother. Jamuka mustered his own followers and agreed to join the campaign against the Merkit. Some sources suggest Jamuka had become quite influential and could rally many fighting men under his banner. So it was that an alliance was formed, three forces united by a common goal of rescuing Börte and humbling the Merkit. Togrul brought the might of the Karaites, seasoned warriors who were fierce in battle and likely numbered in the tens of thousands. Jamuka rallied the Jataran and perhaps other allied clans, young blood eager for glory and plunder. Temujin himself gathered what he could of his own people and those loyal to him. Though his personal retinue was small, he had intimate knowledge of the enemy and burning zeal to lead the charge. By some accounts, the combined host that assembled was around 40,000 strong. Chroniclers later would marvel that so many came to aid a young, relatively obscure chieftain, but it was a testament to Temujin's ability to inspire loyalty and to the respect his allies had for him or his lineage. In truth, Togrul and Jamuka likely saw benefits beyond pure friendship. This campaign promised rich spoils from the Merkit camps and a chance to assert dominance over a rival tribe. But whatever their motives, they committed a massive force to Temujin's cause. Throughout the summer and into autumn of that year, preparations were underway. Messengers galloped across the plains carrying orders. Tribes gathered at appointed meeting places with their horses, bows, and swords ready. Picture the scene. At a large encampment on open grassland, thousands of jurs dotted the plain like a field of white mushrooms. Smoke from cook fires rose into the crisp air as warriors readied for war. Lines of tethered horses, each warrior would have several remounts, stretched out near the camp. The din of activity was constant. Blacksmiths hammering arrowheads and stirrups, herders driving vast flocks to feed the assembled armies, shamans chanting prayers to the sky god Tengri for victory. Amid this bustle, Temujin moved with focused purpose. He was no longer a lone outcast. He was at the head of a great enterprise. Yet he was keenly aware that in the eyes of many, he was still a junior partner. Togrul was the elder Khan, and Jamuka was an established leader with more followers than Temujin. Temujin did not mind. He checked his ego and absorbed everything he could from these more experienced men. This was his first exposure to commanding a large coalition, and he treated it as an invaluable education. At council fires in the evening, the leaders gathered to plan their campaign. Togrul, the veteran, likely offered strategic counsel. Jamuka, known for his tactical acumen and poetic speech, may have taken a leading role in mapping out the route and method of attack. Temujin contributed his intelligence on the Merkit whereabouts and the personal drive behind the mission. All three were determined not only to rescue Börte, but also to deal a crushing blow to the Merkit tribe so that they could never threaten any of them again. Scouts were sent out far ahead, like the sharp eyes of a falcon, to locate the Merkit camps and report their movements. Before long, the scouts returned with valuable information. The Merkit clans, along with their herds and captives, Börte presumably among them, had moved northward toward the lower reaches of the Selenga River, deep in their homeland territory. They were likely encamped in the Bargujan steppe, feeling relatively safe after their successful raid. Perhaps they thought the matter settled. The raid was done, their vengeance taken. It's possible they believed Temujin, even with allies, wouldn't dare pursue them so far into their own domain. If so, they gravely underestimated the ferocity of the response that was coming. The allied army of Kerit, Jadaran, and other Mongol clans began its march to the north. Thousands of mounted warriors spread across the steppe in columns. It was an awe-inspiring host. Banners made of horsehair streamed in the wind from standard poles, each banner marking a company under a particular chief. The ground trembled under the mass of horses. The dust they kicked up drifted like brown clouds on the horizon. Temujin rode among the forward elements, eyes fixed ahead, mind likely churning with anticipation and worry. He had never led men in a major battle before. Would he acquit himself well when the moment of combat came? More importantly, would Börte survive until they could reach her? He had heard nothing of her condition. For all he knew, she could have been killed or badly mistreated. He tried to push such thoughts away. He had to believe she was alive, because that belief drove him onward. The journey took days, perhaps weeks, as the large force had to move carefully and remain coordinated. They navigated rivers and traversed dense forests on the edge of the steppe. The weather was cooling as autumn advanced. At night, when the army made camp, Temujin would lie under the stars, wrapped in a wool cloak, unable to sleep deeply. He often rose and walked among the lines of resting horses or the embers of campfires, wrestling with his thoughts. Once, Jamuka found him awake in the darkest hour before dawn. Jamuka, ever the affable friend, draped an arm around Temujin's shoulders and spoke to him softly to bolster his spirits. "We will get her back, brother," Jamuka might have said. "Together we are strong. The Merkit will pay for their crimes." Temujin likely nodded, grateful but still restless. In Jamuka's face he saw sincere concern, and perhaps something else: excitement. Jamuka relished the prospect of such a grand campaign. Temujin realized that for Jamuka and others, this was not only about saving Börte, it was also about glory and conquest. Temujin promised himself that one day he would build such loyalty that his men would follow him not for loot or politics, but out of devotion. For now, he was thankful to have their strength on his side, whatever their reasons. As the Allied forces drew near the Merkit domain, they took measures to preserve the element of surprise. The Mongols were masters of deception and speed. They likely split their forces for a three-pronged attack, a tactic to encircle the enemy. One contingent, perhaps led by Togrul, would swing to attack from one flank. Another, under Jamuka, would approach from a different direction. Temujin insisted on leading a detachment himself, to be at the forefront where he could personally search for Börte. Togrul and Jamuka, knowing Temujin's motivation, agreed, though they ensured that some seasoned warriors accompanied Temujin to guide him in the thick of battle. The plan was set. They would strike the Merkit camps at a coordinated time, pinning the enemy in a three-sided trap. With luck, the Merkits would be caught completely off guard and swiftly overwhelmed. This needed to be a decisive blow. Temujin and his allies wanted to destroy the Merkit fighting force so thoroughly that the Merkits could not retaliate or even regroup. If any Merkit escaped now, they might return later seeking vengeance yet again. Total victory was the goal. On the eve of the attack, the Allied chiefs gathered for a final council. They likely offered sacrifices, perhaps a mare's milk sprinkled to the sky, or sheep slaughtered to feed the troops and appease the spirits of war. Fires burned low as men murmured prayers or steeled themselves in silence. Temujin sat among his fellows, sharpening his sword by firelight. He murmured to himself a pledge that he would find Börte no matter what. In his mind, he recalled gentle moments. Börte's laughter at some small joke, or the way she furrowed her brow in thought when they discussed camp matters. He held on to these memories to keep himself from drowning in rage. He needed a clear head now. It would not serve Börte if he lost control in the heat of battle. He had to be as calculating as he was furious. Many warriors did not sleep at all that night, adrenaline coursing too strongly. Temujin might have closed his eyes under the dark canopy of the sky and spoken softly to the spirits of his ancestors, asking for their guidance. One imagines he thought of his father, Yesuge, and wondered if the spirit of Yesuge watched proudly as his son prepared to avenge their family honor. He certainly must have thought of his mother Huelun and how she had always fought against despair. That gave him strength. Huelun had never given up through starvation and abandonment, so he, Temujin, would not give up now. Börte was depending on him. Before dawn, the Allied army advanced on the Merkit encampment. The Merkit had made camp along the river plain, their jurs clustered in several groups, with livestock pens and corrals around. It was likely late autumn. Perhaps frost coated the grass, crunching under horses' hooves as the attackers drew into position. The sky was still dark, and a half moon provided a cold, pale glow, just enough to see the outlines of the enemy camp in the distance. The Mongol attackers split off silently into their predetermined divisions, surrounding the Merkit positions from different sides, creeping as near as they dared without raising an alarm. Temujin's heart was pounding in his chest. He tightened the grip on his reins and glanced at the men around him, hardened Karaite warriors and his own companions. They nodded to him in the dark, awaiting his signal. At the appointed moment, as the very first hint of dawn's light touched the eastern sky, a horn was blown, or perhaps a piercing war cry was unleashed. It was the signal to attack. With a terrifying synchronicity, the Allied forces charged. They thundered towards the unsuspecting Merkit camps, yelling battle cries that shattered the pre-dawn stillness. Temujin was at the front of his wedge of riders, urging his horse faster. He let out a primal shout, whether in fury or to inspire his men, and in that cry all his fear and hope commingled. The Merkit sentries, if any were posted, barely had time to react. One moment all was quiet. The next, dark shapes on horseback were upon them, arrows and spears raining death. The first clash was explosive. Horses collided with tent ropes and wooden carts. Mongol blades sliced through felt walls as they fired arrows into anything that moved. The Merkits, caught utterly off guard, scrambled out of their beds to defend themselves. Confusion and panic swept through the Merkit camp. Some warriors managed to grab bows or spears and stagger out to fight, but many were cut down before they could even string an arrow. Women screamed, children cried out. It was chaos as entire families tried to flee. Jamuka's wing attacked from another side with equal ferocity, and Togrul's forces from a third. Soon the Merkit found themselves encircled. Those who tried to run north towards the river discovered more enemies riding in from that direction. The Merkit chieftain, a man named Toktoa Beki, hurried to rally his men, but the assault was too swift. Some accounts say he attempted to mount a horse and escape when he saw that the battle was lost. Indeed, a number of Merkit leaders and warriors, including Toktoa's kin, fled as the slaughter unfolded, some of them heading west in desperation towards the lands of other tribes. The majority of the Merkit fighters, however, were overwhelmed and perished in their own camp. To Temujin's eyes, the scene was both dreadful and heartening. Dreadful in the sense that it was a massacre, yurts burning, men and animals screaming, but heartening in that victory was clearly at hand. He pushed forward, barely pausing to engage in fighting himself unless someone directly barred his way. His comrades protected his flanks, aware that Temujin's mission was singular: find Börte. "Börte!" he cried hoarsely as he rode through the camp. He shouted her name again and again, his voice raw with emotion. Each time he called, he listened intently amid the cacophony for a response. Merkit families were fleeing in all directions now. Some waded into the shallow parts of the river, trying to escape by water. Others just ran on foot across the steppe, but mounted attackers quickly overtook many of them. Temujin ordered some of his men to corral a group of prisoners, women and children mostly, and a few warriors who had surrendered or been knocked off their horses. Perhaps she would be among them, he thought. He scanned every terrified face he passed, looking for the one he loved. During the pell-mell of combat, he almost missed it. A familiar voice, faint amid the noise, calling his name. Temujin! It was a woman's voice, high and desperate. He pulled hard on his reins, nearly causing his horse to rear. Had he imagined it? Then he heard it again, clearer. Temujin! He wheeled his horse towards the sound, galloping past a cluster of fleeing merchant families. Ahead, two figures stood by a jolting ox cart, trying to get away. A woman had leapt down from that cart and was now running towards him, calling his name in a piercing cry. Temujin's breath caught in his throat. He knew that voice even before his eyes confirmed what he hoped. It was Börte. The first light of morning was strengthening, and in that gray-blue glow he saw her. Börte, alive, rushing toward him, her hair streaming behind her. She had recognized him, perhaps by his posture on horseback or the reins and tether of his horse that she knew so well. Behind her was another person, a young woman named Coakchin, a fellow captive or handmaiden, also running and reaching out. Temujin vaulted off his horse almost before it had stopped and ran to meet Börte. In that moment, amidst all the chaos, it was as if time slowed for the two of them. They came together and Börte threw herself into Temujin's arms. He caught her, lifting her off the ground in a crushing embrace. For a heartbeat, they simply clung to each other, speechless. Temujin could feel her trembling against him, and he realized he was trembling too, out of relief, out of overwhelming joy and emotion. The moon was still faintly visible in the dawn sky, and by its pale light he looked at her face. It was streaked with tears, eyes red from weeping, but to him she was the most beautiful sight in the world. Börte, he whispered, voice breaking. She sobbed his name once more, burying her face in his shoulder. They held each other like that as the last skirmishes died down around them. One of Temujin's men rode by, recognized his lord and the lady Börte embracing, and whooped in triumph. The primary objective was accomplished. Lady Börte was found and safe. Word quickly spread among Temujin's soldiers and allies. Börte has been rescued. This added a fervor of elation to the already lopsided battle. Any remaining pockets of merchant resistance were crushed without mercy. The Mongol warriors knew their mission was achieved and now indulged fully in taking vengeance and spoils. Temujin gently pulled back to examine Börte. He held her at arm's length for a moment, scanning her to ensure she was not badly injured. She was thinner than he remembered, her cheeks hollowed slightly from hardship. There was a bruise on her arm, and her clothes were travel-worn and dirty. But she was very much alive, and the light in her eyes, that lively intelligence he adored, still shone, now mixed with tears of relief. Börte, for her part, took in the sight of Temujin's face, haggard from worry and lack of sleep, perhaps blood-splattered from battle, but undeniably her husband, come for her at last. In all her dark nights of captivity, she had feared she might never see him again. Now here he was, as real as the earth beneath her feet, holding her as if he'd never let go. They spoke then, words tumbling out amid tears. What they said has not been recorded word for word, but we can imagine. Perhaps Temujin choked out, "I found you, thank the sky, I found you." And Börte, sobbing, said, "I knew you would come. I prayed you would come." He might have apologized over and over for not protecting her that night of the raid. She likely shook her head and just held on to him tighter, grateful to be in his arms again. Temujin may have promised her in that moment that no one would ever take her from him again, that he would forever keep her safe from any enemy. Börte, calming herself, might have reassured him, "I am safe now, it's over." She may have also informed him, shyly or emotionally, of something he could not yet see under her loose deal robe. She was with child. Yes, Börte had been held captive by the Merkit for several months. Some sources say around 8 months passed from her abduction to this rescue. During that time, according to the accounts, she had been given to a Merkit man as a spoil of war. In fact, it was Böke, the younger brother of the Merkit, whom Temujin's father had wronged, who took Börte as his wife in captivity. It is almost cruel how fate intertwined these events. Börte ended up in the hands of the very family that had lost Höglund decades earlier. The Merkit had indeed intended a wife for a wife. Börte likely endured great fear and uncertainty during her captivity. We do not know the full extent of mistreatment she suffered, but it's recorded that Böke claimed her as his own. She became pregnant during these months, whether by Chilgur or, less likely given the timing, from her brief time with Temujin before the kidnapping. No one could be certain. By the time of her rescue, Börte was well along in pregnancy. Imagine the anxiety she must have felt as Temujin came for her. Would her husband accept her condition? In those harsh times, a woman who was raped or impregnated by another man could be shunned or cast aside. Börte herself might have feared that Temujin would look at her and see another man's child, an heir of dishonor. But if such thoughts plagued her, Temujin's actions dispelled them immediately. When he realized Börte was pregnant, he did not recoil or show any sign of anger towards her. If anything, his heart swelled with empathy and admiration for her courage. She had survived the ordeal. That was all that mattered. Temujin wrapped a protective arm around Börte and assured her that she was his wife, now and always, and that the child she carried would be accepted as his own. In front of his warriors and the captives, Temujin treated Börte with undiminished respect and love. By publicly affirming her and embracing her condition, he silenced any potential murmurs then and there. Everyone could see that Genghis Khan, though not yet called that, stood by Börte unwaveringly, and therefore so should they. With Börte found, Temujin turned his attention back to the battlefield and the mopping up of the raid's aftermath. The Merkit forces had been utterly crushed. Their camps were ablaze. Columns of smoke twisted up into the morning sky, marking the fall of a proud tribe. Bodies of Merkit warriors lay scattered among the wreckage of smashed jurs. The victorious Allied soldiers were rounding up herds of Merkit horses and cattle as spoils. They were also corralling Merkit women and children, those who hadn't been killed, intending to distribute them as slaves or adopt them into their own tribes, as was customary. It was a day of complete and decisive triumph for Temujin and his allies. Temujin, however, was not swept up in the plunder. He stayed by Börte's side, helping her onto a gentle horse and making sure she was attended to. His priority was to ensure her safety and comfort now that she was back with him. He called for his sister or mother, whichever female kin were present, to come tend to Börte, to give her fresh clothes and food and whatever care she needed after her long ordeal. Possibly he sought out a felt blanket to wrap around her against the morning chill. One can imagine him hovering close, not wanting to let her out of his sight, still half in disbelief that she was truly here and alive. As the dust settled, Togrul Khan and Jamuka rode up to congratulate Temujin. They were all smiles and exultation. Here was a great victory. They had crushed the Merkit menace, seized rich booty, and fulfilled their oath to retrieve Börte. Togrul, with avuncular pride, likely said something like, "Well done, my son. Your wife is recovered, and our enemies scatter before us." Jamuka, too, expressed joy, perhaps teasing Temujin affectionately that now he owed them a share of the feasting for all this effort. Temujin thanked them both sincerely. He knew that without Togrul's might and Jamuka's men, he could not have succeeded. He acknowledged their crucial roles. In his heart, Temujin was filled with gratitude and relief. This was not just a victory. It felt almost like a rebirth. The despair of that night when Börte was taken had transformed into the triumph of her rescue. Temujin had snatched back the one thing that mattered most to him. In doing so, he had also proven something to himself and to the world. He was not a nobody to be trampled on. He could marshal armies and enact vengeance on a grand scale. With the battle concluded, the Allied forces took stock of their gains. The spoil was enormous. The Merkits had considerable wealth in livestock, furs, and other goods, and now those were in the hands of Temujin's coalition. There were also prisoners. Many Merkit women and children, and whatever warriors survived, were effectively captives. Traditionally, each ally would take a portion of the spoils. Togrul and Jamuka's men certainly expected their shares. Temujin, wise beyond his years, did not begrudge them this. In fact, he was generous in the division of loot, as that would only strengthen the bonds with his allies. He likely ensured that Togrul's contingent received a lion's share of animals and other goods, a gesture of respect to the senior partner. Jamuka's men, too, would have been rewarded well with fine horses and plunder. As for Temujin, what he wanted most was already in his possession: Börte. Any material gains were secondary to him, though they certainly were welcome to help rebuild his and Börte's household. One thing Temujin did claim for himself, however, was revenge upon certain Merkit individuals. If Chilgur Boko, the Merkit who had taken Börte, had been captured, it's likely Temujin would have dealt with him swiftly and ruthlessly. Some sources indicate that Chilgur Boko was killed around this time, perhaps during the attack or executed shortly after. Temujin would not have wanted a man who violated his wife to live. The same can be said for other Merkit leaders present. While many rank-and-file Merkit who surrendered might be spared to be slaves, their chieftains who orchestrated the raid faced no mercy. This too would serve as a warning to all. Anyone who dared harm Temujin's family would meet a grim fate. When the dust of combat finally settled and the spoils were divided, the Great Alliance prepared to disband and return home. The campaign had been a resounding success. Togrul Khan took his Karait warriors and began the journey back to his territory, laden with wealth and now strengthened by the knowledge that a threat, the Merkit, had been removed from his northern flank. Before leaving, Togrul likely embraced Temujin and perhaps even Börte, offering blessings for her health. He might have said something ceremonious like, "Today we have struck down your enemies. May you and your wife live long under the protection of eternal heaven." Temujin bowed respectfully and thanked him again, calling him Khan Father, reaffirming that quasi-father-son bond between them. Togrul parted with warm feelings towards Temujin, pleased with both the victory and the black sable coat's well-repaid value. Jamuka too parted on good terms, at least for now. In fact, after the Merkit raid, Jamuka and Temujin's forces didn't immediately separate. According to sources, they camped together for some time, possibly months, even around a year and a half, celebrating their brotherhood renewed through this victory. They shared the spoils and stories, and their bond seemed stronger than ever. The secret history of the Mongols recounts that during this period, Jamuka and Temujin were so close that they slept under one blanket, an expression indicating deep companionship and trust. They organized great feasts to honor the victory. Around flickering campfires, the combined followers of Jamuka and Temujin feasted on roasted meat, drank fermented mare's milk, erog, and sang long epics of heroes and battles. Jamuka, who was a charismatic orator, might have composed verses on the spot praising Temujin's courage and the retrieval of Börte. The men cheered and shouted acclaim for Temujin, lifting bowls of kumis in toast. One can imagine Börte sitting beside Temujin at such a feast, wrapped in a warm deal, quietly observing with a contented smile as her husband was honored by his peers. Her ordeal was over, and she was once again surrounded by familiar faces and caring voices. Perhaps Halen was there too, rejoicing in her son's victory and the safe return of her daughter-in-law. The relief in the family was immense. During one of those nights, Jamuka presented Temujin with a title or prize to mark the occasion. Some sources suggest that Jamuka's men acknowledged Temujin now as a Khan, chief, in his own right, because of his leadership and the success of the campaign. It wasn't the title of Genghis Khan yet, of course, but it was a recognition that Temujin was no longer just a ragged outcast or minor youth. He was now a force to be reckoned with, a leader who had tasted a major victory. Temujin graciously accepted such honors, but remained wary of pride. In quiet moments alone with Börte, he likely confided his feelings, joy at having her back, and a burning desire to ensure that such a tragedy would never befall them again. Börte, eyes filled with understanding, surely echoed that sentiment. She never wished to be a captive again, and she believed in Temujin's ability to protect their growing family. And so the rescue of Börte marked the end of one chapter of Temujin's life and the beginning of another. He had set out to save his wife and avenge the wrong, and he had achieved both beyond any doubt. In doing so, he had fundamentally changed his own standing and mindset. He was no longer the boy who was hunted and the youth who lived in fear. He had become a warrior chief who could unite thousands and crush his enemies. This event was transformative. It taught Temujin several crucial lessons that would shape his approach to the world and pave the path for his future empire. First, Temujin learned the supreme value of loyalty, especially the loyalty between himself and those closest to him. Börte had been his first true ally and love, and the agony he felt at her loss taught him just how much he depended on that bond. When he risked everything to save her, he was demonstrating his own loyalty in return. And Börte's unwavering faith that Temujin would come, for she had believed in his return, reinforced for him that loyalty had to be treasured and rewarded. In the years that followed, Temujin would hold loyalty as the highest virtue among his followers. He would forge an empire by binding men to him, not just by fear or greed, but by a sense of personal loyalty and trust, much as he and Börte were bound. Börte, for her part, remained at his side as his confidant and advisor through every major decision ahead. Temujin came to rely on her counsel often. She had a keen mind and would help manage not only the domestic affairs of their expanding camp, but also occasionally weigh in on political and military matters. Their partnership, cemented in adversity, lasted until death parted them. This level of partnership between a conqueror and his wife was extraordinary in those days. Börte wasn't merely a figurehead consort. She was integral to Temujin's plans. When he later became the Great Khan, Börte was his great Khatun, queen, and had her own court and authority. Temujin trusted her to rule the home territories while he was away on campaigns. In essence, the rescue of Börte solidified in Temujin's heart that loyalty is everything. Those who were loyal to him, like Börte, like the allies who helped him, deserved his loyalty and reward in turn. And those who betrayed him, like the Tayachiyud or the Merkit, deserved nothing but destruction. The second lesson that night and its aftermath taught was the harsh principle of total retribution. Temujin saw clearly that if you leave an enemy alive and wounded, they will nurse their grudge and come back again, just as the Merkit had done after many years. He understood now that to ensure his family's safety and his own survival, he could not half-measure his vengeance or his warfare. The Merkits had raided him out of revenge for something that happened in the past, so Temujin concluded the only way to end a feud was to eliminate the enemy completely. This ethos hardened into one of the trademarks of Temujin's approach in later years: surrender or face annihilation. In subsequent battles, Temujin often gave enemies a chance to submit. If they refused and fought, he would unleash unprecedented brutality to wipe them out root and branch, so that no further threat would remain. This ruthless completeness in revenge was perhaps a direct result of the Merkit episode. It was both personal. He never wanted to experience such loss again, and practical. He saw the strategic value in making decisive examples of those who crossed him. Indeed, the Merkit tribe itself would experience this fully in later years. While the initial rescue operation scattered them, it did not entirely wipe them out. Remnants of the Merkits survived, some fleeing west into the lands of the Naiman tribe, some lying low in the forests. Temujin did not forget them. Over the next couple of decades, whenever he found the Merkit regaining any strength or aligning with his enemies, he hunted them down again. By the early 1200s, he and his generals, including his eldest son, had clashed with the Merkit several more times, each time decimating their numbers. Finally, around 1204, Temujin, then on the cusp of uniting all Mongols under his rule, delivered the final blow to the Merkit people. They, along with their allies the Naimans, were defeated utterly. The Merkit ceased to exist as a distinct people. Those not killed were absorbed into other tribes or taken as slaves. This was Temujin's ultimate payback for that night, an entire nation erased in retribution for the capture of Börte. It's a chilling thought. The kidnapping of one woman resulted in the destruction of an entire tribe, numbering in the tens of thousands. Temujin's wrath, once provoked, would burn relentlessly until he considered the score settled. The third key lesson from this chapter of Temujin's life was the power of alliance and unity. Temujin realized that alone he was vulnerable, but with allies he was formidable. He had always known alliances were useful. He had tried to secure them through marriage with Börte's tribe, and through oath with Jamuka, and through patronage with Togrul. But the rescue of Börte was the first grand test of those alliances. It showed him that bringing together disparate groups for a common purpose could yield spectacular results. No single tribe on its own could easily have overwhelmed the Merkit in their home, but the joint force of Karait, Jadaran, and Temujin's own people did so with ease. This vindicated Temujin's belief that unity was strength and that a fractured step only weakened all Mongols. In the aftermath, Temujin grew more convinced that the Mongol tribes needed to stop their endless feuding and unite, preferably under a strong leader. At that point, he might not have been presumptuous enough to imagine himself as that great leader of all, but the seed was planted. He'd seen what synergy could do. Over the next years, Temujin continued to build on alliances. He stayed close with Jamuka, calling him Anda and sharing the spoils of war. He maintained a dutiful relationship with Togrul, even referring to him as Khan Etseg, meaning Khan father or foster father. With these relationships, Temujin slowly expanded his influence. More and more warriors, hearing of Temujin's valor and the generous way he shared loot and credit with his allies, began to gravitate towards him. The rescue of Börte had made Temujin's name known beyond his immediate circle. Stories traveled across the steppe of how this young chief had raised a great army to get his wife back and annihilated the Merkit. This earned him both admiration and wariness. Admirations from those who valued courage and loyalty, wariness from those who realized that Temujin was becoming a dangerous contender in the steppe power game. Börte's rescue mission thus was not just a personal affair, but the crucible in which Temujin's leadership was forged. After the Merkit campaign, Temujin's standing among Mongols was elevated significantly. Not long after, a number of his own followers proclaimed him a Khan in his own right. By 1189, Temujin was reportedly elected as Khan by his small tribe. This likely included those of his relatives and others who had joined him because of his burgeoning reputation. This marked the formal beginning of his quest to unify the Mongols under his sole rulership. The bond between Temujin and Jamuka, sadly, did not remain as golden as it was in the heady days after Börte's rescue. For about 2 years, they camped together and undertook joint raids against common enemies, expanding their reach. But differences in their leadership style and the envy of their followers began to drive a wedge between them. Jamuka came from a noble lineage and saw himself as the senior partner. Temujin was rising swiftly in fame and gathering a more cohesive, disciplined following. Eventually, a split occurred. Some of Temujin's followers complained that Jamuka had grown arrogant or that he favored aristocratic traditions they disliked, whereas Temujin treated common warriors more equally. In 1190 or 1191, Jamuka and Temujin parted ways, and many of the combined followers chose to follow Temujin rather than Jamuka. This wounded Jamuka's pride deeply. The two men became rivals for power among the Mongols. Over the next decade, they would battle each other multiple times for supremacy. It was a bitter, Shakespearean turn. The blood brothers turned against one another. In those conflicts, one can still see the ghost of the Merkit episode. Jamuka, at one point, allied with remnants of the Merkit and other tribes to challenge Temujin. Meanwhile, Temujin, guided by Börte's advice and his own instincts, grew increasingly resolute that he must eliminate Jamuka if he could not win him back. In one instance, as recorded by some chronicles, Börte herself recognized that Jamuka's friendship was irreparably broken and counseled Temujin to decisively break away and fight Jamuka. Temujin did so. Eventually, in 1204 to 1205, Jamuka was betrayed by his own men and handed over to Temujin. Remembering their old bond, Temujin offered Jamuka clemency and friendship once more. But Jamuka refused, saying that there could only be one sun in the sky. He requested an honorable death with no blood spilled, so his aristocratic soul would be unharmed. Temujin granted this. Jamuka was executed, likely by having his back broken, a method that shed no blood. Temujin buried Jamuka with honor. It was a sorrowful end to what had been a great friendship. And ironically, it was the success of the alliance, like in rescuing Börte, that had in part led to their falling out. Temujin's star had risen too high, and Jamuka's pride could not accept coming second. Togrul Khan's relationship with Temujin also deteriorated in time. Initially strong like father and son, it soured as Temujin's power grew. Togrul's own son Sengum grew jealous and suspicious of Temujin's popularity and tried to turn his father against him. At one point, Temujin proposed to solidify their bond by marrying one of his children to Togrul's daughter, or vice versa. But Togrul's camp, considering Temujin's uncertain birth status given the questions around Joki's paternity and Temujin's non-noble early days, took offense. That miscommunication spiraled into open conflict. By 1203, Togrul and Temujin were at war. Temujin's forces won decisively. Togrul was routed and fled. The old Khan, once a great benefactor, met an ignominious end. He was reportedly killed by a band of Naiman scouts who found him in hiding, not recognizing him as the famed Wang Khan. Thus, both of the senior allies who had helped Temujin in his hour of need fell by the wayside as Temujin climbed to supremacy. It is a poignant reminder that the alliances Temujin used were pragmatic. When those allies became obstacles or threats, Temujin did not hesitate to remove them. But he always remembered what he had learned through those alliances: how to build coalitions, and then, if necessary, how to dismantle those who turned against him. Börte, through all this, remained Temujin's steady North Star. After her rescue, she reestablished herself as the mistress of Temujin's growing camp. She gave birth, a few months after being rescued, to a son. They named him Yoki. The name in Mongolian means guest or visitor, which subtly acknowledged the lingering question of his paternity. Joki's birth around 1185 was a source of both joy and delicate controversy. Temujin publicly declared Jochi to be his firstborn son, and by Mongol custom, that made Jochi the most senior of his children. Börte was immensely grateful to Temujin for this acceptance. In private, who can say what the couple discussed about it? Perhaps late at night, Börte might have tearfully expressed worry that some would always whisper about Jochi's blood. Temujin likely comforted her, saying that Jochi was their child no matter what, and that anyone who dared question that would face his wrath. Indeed, Temujin's own mother, Hoelun, took a special interest in Jochi's upbringing, which in Mongol culture signified full acceptance. Grandmothers often raised and doted on the children. Nevertheless, as Jochi grew into a talented warrior and leader, the question of his parentage did not entirely vanish. Temujin and Börte went on to have 3 more sons together after Jochi, all unquestionably Temujin's by blood. Chagatai, born not long after Jochi, Ogedei, born a couple of years later, and Tolui, the youngest, born around 1192. They also had a number of daughters, 4 or 5 who survived to adulthood, who were married off to important allies to secure Temujin's alliances across the region. Within the family, it was Chagatai, the second son, who most openly challenged Jochi's legitimacy. From youth, Chagatai, a fiery and proud character, sometimes insulted Jochi in front of others, calling him a bastard or saying, "We don't even know if you are truly my father's son." These jibes enraged Jochi and caused deep rifts between the brothers. Once, it escalated to the point where Chagatai basically declared that a child of uncertain blood should not inherit the leadership. When Temujin heard of this, he was furious. He rebuked Chagatai harshly for disrespecting his mother, Börte, and himself by questioning Jochi. Temujin made it clear that he considered such talk unacceptable and that Jochi was to be honored as his eldest son. But the tension lingered. Börte doubtless was pained to see her sons quarrel in this way, knowing that it stemmed from her trauma. Yet she could not erase what had happened. She could only try to keep the family unified. As Temujin's power grew, and he eventually, by 1206, united the Mongol tribes and was proclaimed Genghis Khan, Great Khan of the Mongols, the issue of succession simmered beneath the surface. Genghis Khan, let us call him that now as we speak of the later period of his life, remembered how personal turmoil can affect empire. He had seen how a single act, like Börte's kidnapping, had set so many events into motion. He surely worried how the rivalry between Jochi and Chagatai might one day tear apart his legacy. In the end, Genghis Khan made a difficult decision, largely influenced by that fraternal feud. He did not choose Jochi or Chagatai as his successor. Instead, he chose his third son, Ogedei, a man known for being level-headed and a peacemaker between his older brothers. Genghis likely felt Ogedei would be able to hold the empire together without the baggage of Jochi and Chagatai's animosity. Börte supported this decision, as she was pragmatic and put the empire's stability first, and perhaps she too saw Ogedei's temperament as suitable. Tragically, by the time Genghis Khan died in 1227, Jochi was also dead. He died a few months before his father. Some say it was illness. Others whisper it might have been arranged due to fears of Jochi's independence. He had grown very autonomous out on the western steppe with his own armies, and rumors of tension with his father existed. The truth remains uncertain. Chagatai was alive but was assigned his own realm in Central Asia with no claim to the supreme title. Ogedei indeed succeeded as Great Khan. Thus, in a sense, the shadow of the Merkit raid stretched decades into the future. It influenced who would inherit the largest empire on Earth. Had Börte never been captured, Jochi's birth would never have been doubted, and perhaps Jochi, as the eldest capable son, might have been the clear heir of Genghis Khan. History might have been quite different, for better or worse. But Genghis Khan managed the issue as best he could, and Börte saw her sons all established with their own uluses, territories, eventually. Throughout Genghis Khan's astonishing conquests, from the borders of China to the Caspian Sea, Börte remained a central figure behind the scenes. She did not travel with him on long campaigns. Some other wives did, but Börte as First Lady stayed to administer the heartland. In Mongolia, Börte oversaw the home front, managing the logistics of the empire's herds and the governance of the Mongol homeland along with Genghis's younger brother Temujin. She was renowned for her organizational skills and wisdom. Ambassadors and foreign merchants who dealt with the Mongols often had to interact with Börte or her court, finding that she was a shrewd negotiator. When Genghis Khan set out on his world war, he entrusted to Börte the stability of the realm behind him. Such was his trust in her capabilities. This trust had its roots in that early crisis they weathered together. They had become unbreakable partners after surviving the Merkit ordeal. Börte lived to see the Mongol Empire at its height, and her children in high positions. She died in 1230, a few years after Genghis Khan's own death. She was probably in her late 60s, which was a venerable age for those times, and Genghis Khan himself died in his mid-60s. Upon her death, she was honored as the Grand Empress of the Mongols. The Mongol people, who can be quite unsentimental in many respects, actually revered Börte for what she had done and what she represented. She was the matriarch of the Golden Family, the mother of a dynasty that would rule Asia for generations. They remembered that it was she who stood beside the great Khan from the very beginning, through the hardest trials. And what of the Merkits, whose vengeful act had set all this in motion? As mentioned, they never recovered as a tribe. After 1184, they were broken and scattered. In 1190s, Temujin fought them again, and in 1200 he defeated a coalition including Merkit remnants. Finally, in 1204, after defeating the Naiman Confederation, another major victory in Temujin's rise, he hunted down the Merkit chief Toktoa Beki, the same one who fled the 1184 battle. Toktoa was killed, and the remaining Merkit people were absorbed into the Mongol nation. Some women and children of the Merkit were given to Mongol nobles or taken as wives. Interestingly, one of Genghis Khan's later beloved wives, Kulan, was said to be a Merkit captured around 1203, showing that even as he destroyed a people, he could accept individuals into his family. Other Merkit survivors fled west into the Kipchak steppes, modern Kazakhstan, mixing with those peoples. But even there, Genghis's long arm caught them. In 1217, he sent his general Subutai and son Jochi on a campaign where they crushed the Merkit refugees who had sought shelter with the Kipchaks. By then, the Merkit story as an independent entity was well and truly over. In Mongol histories, they become a cautionary tale, a once proud tribe erased by the wrath of Temujin. It all stemmed from one night's misdeed on their part, an act they thought of as rightful revenge, but which unleashed a far greater wrath upon them. Now, stepping back, what did this whole saga mean for Temujin, and why is it remembered? The kidnapping of Börte could have been just another tragic footnote in the bloody annals of steppe feuds. Similar abductions happened countless times in that era. Brides were stolen, families avenged, and the wheel of violence turned. But this case was different because of who Temujin became. If Temujin had failed to save Börte, perhaps he would have remained a minor chief, embittered and broken. Instead, her abduction became the crucible that forged him into a leader of destiny. It lit within him the dual fires of ambition and ruthless determination. He tasted what it meant to harness the power of unity and saw the necessity of being merciless to enemies. In rescuing Börte, Temujin rescued more than his wife. He rescued his future empire. For had Börte been lost or killed, Temujin's story might have ended there in despair or obscurity. Börte was integral to Temujin's drive. She gave him a reason to fight beyond himself. And after the rescue, she was there to encourage his loftier goals. It is often mused by historians that behind every great man, there may be a great woman. In Temujin's case, Börte was certainly a great woman whose influence is harder to quantify but deeply felt. She humanized him in some ways. He could be unbelievably cruel to enemies, but with family and trusted ones, he was known to be remarkably generous and caring. That dichotomy in Genghis Khan's character, ferocious conqueror to the outside world, but intensely loyal and loving to those within his inner circle, can be traced back to experiences like losing and regaining Börte. The rescue of Börte can also be seen as the first chapter in the creation of an empire built on personal bonds transformed into law. Genghis Khan's empire would later have a code, the yasa, and principles that emphasized loyalty, discipline, and unity above tribal loyalties. Those concepts weren't born in a vacuum. They came from his life experiences. He had seen tribes betray his family, the Taichiud, and the destruction that internal division brings. He had also seen how a united effort, the coalition to save Börte, could overcome any foe. So he strove to eliminate divisions among the Mongols and turn their loyalty to one universal cause, his cause. In 1206, when he was formally declared Genghis Khan of all Mongols at the Great Kurultai Assembly, it was the culmination of a journey that arguably began on that night in 1184 when Börte was stolen. Imagine for a moment if that incident had never occurred. No merkits abducting Börte. Perhaps Temujin would have continued as a minor ally of Togrul, living a quieter life. Maybe Jamuka and he would not have had such a strong campaign to cement and then challenge their relationship. Possibly, without the burning need for vengeance and rescue, Temujin's ruthless streak might not have been triggered to the same extent so early. Without the glory and confidence gained from defeating the Merkit, would others have rallied to him as they did? Would he have had the momentum to start conquering the rest of the tribes? It's impossible to say for sure, but it's likely that the kidnapping was a catalyst that accelerated everything. It gave Temujin a story, a legend even, that would precede him. The man who would storm the gates of hell to get his wife back. That kind of reputation wins people's respect on the steppe, and it certainly deepened his own conviction that he was favored by heaven to achieve something great. For how many men get to defeat their enemies and snatch victory from such jaws of despair? In the final analysis, the night the Merkits stole Börte set off a chain reaction. It led to the destruction of one tribe, the Merkits, then contributed to the downfall of others, Togrul's Karaite and Jamuka's faction, and eventually it played into the Mongols exploding outward to conquer many nations. Genghis Khan's fury, once ignited, did not subside with one act of revenge. It became a force that propelled him forward to carve out the largest contiguous empire in history. Millions would feel the effects. Cities across Asia and Europe would tremble at the approach of the Mongol armies. And in a way, it could be said that all of it traced back to one cold night, one quiet camp by a river, one beloved wife stolen away in the dark. For the Mongols themselves, stories of that event were told and retold in the generations after. Mongol bards would recount how the great Khan recovered his beautiful Börte Khatun from the clutches of the Merkits, how he called her name on the battlefield and found her, how heaven clearly meant for them to be together. It became part of the lore of Genghis Khan's almost providential invincibility, that even when struck in his most vulnerable spot, fortune and his own indomitable will restored what was lost. Now, as we reach the conclusion of this tale, consider what it reveals about Temujin, the man who became Genghis Khan. We often remember Genghis Khan for the rivers of blood he spilled, for the terror his name invoked from China to Persia to Russia. We recall a relentless conqueror on horseback, leading disciplined hordes that seemed nearly supernatural in their swiftness and ferocity. All of that is true. But behind the terrifying legend was a man of flesh and blood, with a heart capable of deep love and loyalty. The story of Börte's abduction shows us that human side, a husband frantic to save his wife, a leader who cherished those loyal to him and would move heaven and earth on their behalf. It also shows that from the very beginning, Genghis Khan's drive to conquer had a personal dimension. He was not initially seeking to rule the world. He was seeking to rescue the person dearest to him in the world. The empire came later, built on the lessons learned and the alliances formed during that personal quest. As you drift off to sleep, think of the lonely steppe and how beneath the eternal sky, the greatest of events can be set in motion by the smallest of domestic tragedies, a wife taken, a husband's desperate love. History often turns on such intimate moments. If Börte had not been taken, who knows if Temujin would have risen to unite the Mongols. Perhaps the tribes would have remained disunited a while longer, and the course of empires would be different. But she was taken, and Temujin's response to that crisis defined not only his character, but the fate of half the world. Picture now in your mind's eye the Mongolian grasslands long after these events. The fires have died out, the battles are over, centuries have passed. On a quiet night, the steppe is once again as it was in the beginning, vast, silent, under a dome of endless stars. You might imagine the spirits of those who once rode there. Perhaps you see the silhouette of a man and a woman on horseback, side by side, riding across the plain under the moonlight. He is broad-shouldered and watchful. She is strong and serene. They pause on a hill to gaze over the land that was their home. In the wind, one might almost hear her laughter or his gentle teasing, the echoes of a love that endured through all the fury and fire of their age. The world they knew is gone to dust. The great Khans and their soldiers, the Gurs and the herds, even the names of the tribes, they have all faded into history. But the story remains. The memory of that night when Temujin found his camp cold and empty, when Börte's absence pierced his heart, and when he resolved to change everything. This memory still whispers on the Mongolian wind. It reminds us that even the greatest conqueror who ever lived was driven in part by the simple, profound devotion to his family. Now the steppe is quiet. The hoofbeats of war have long ceased. In the stillness, one can almost sense the spirits of Temujin and Börte at peace, reunited beyond all travails. The Mongol Empire they built together has dissolved into the pages of history, but the bond between them outlasted it. As the night deepens and you close your eyes, remember how one act of loyalty and determination can ripple through time. A young man's love for his wife sparked a vengeance that conquered nations. Yet here, in the calm of the present night, we let those tumultuous times drift away. Imagine the stars over the steppe shining gently, the same stars that shone on Temujin and Börte during their darkest and brightest nights. The fires are ashes now, the swords are sheathed forever, and the world breathes softly in sleep. In those winds that sweep the grass, there is a lingering hush of respect for the saga that unfolded long ago. The night Genghis Khan's wife was stolen, and how 40,000 lives paid the price, setting into motion the legacy of one of history's most formidable figures. Sleep now under the vast sky, knowing that from great trials can come great destiny, and that even in the harshest of histories, love and loyalty have their honored place. The story is told, the echoes settle. The campfires of the past glow faintly and then wink out, one by one across the plains. All that remains is the soft, enduring light of the stars and the gentle lullaby of the steppe. Sleep well. You've been listening to Wispy History, where the past whispers and time stands still for a little while. If this story kept you company tonight, let me know what part lingered in your thoughts and tell me where in the world you're listening from. Don't forget to like and subscribe to help these quiet journeys continue. Until next time, rest easy, dream deeply, and remember, history is never really gone. It's only sleeping, waiting to be told again. Good night.